Hey everybody, and welcome back to the next part of the teardown. It's been a few months actually. The human malware, as everyone's kind of calling it, it's put a bit of a stamp in a lot of the plans and the rebuild. It's changed a lot of the plans going forwards and how this is going to be rectified. So I have here the piston. As you can see, it looks kind of beautiful. Yeah, it's cactus. So I actually managed to get a hold of VAC Motorsports, and we're going to look at getting some 84.75 mil like sized pistons, which is kind of oversized, if that makes sense, being that 84.5 is the current oversize level in terms of piston sizing. So basically, going forwards, what we've actually done, we actually have a test stock motor in the car right now, and we've been running a stage 2 custom stage 2 turbo. It flows a little bit more than the pure turbos. We're running that on the car now, and hopefully, provided everything goes right and lockdown isn't too challenging here, we might try and get it on a dyno within the next month or so. Quarter mile time's probably going to be a while away because our local track is actually doing some renovations to the drag strip. But hopefully, we're looking at making, I would like to say, somewhere close to 400 wheel horsepower, just based off some of the boost and timing, etc., that we're running. It really comes down to the dyno though. So the dynos we have here do read typically a bit lower than some of the dynos in America. I think we're running on maybe a Mustang dyno, but don't hold me to that. I'll have to double check. But we're running 23 pounder boost from 3800 RPM on 98 RON, or 93 for your US guys. And then from about 4500 RPM all the way to 6900 RPM, we're running 24 pounder boost on an EC only flash. And this has been tuned by myself with the help of the other guys on this channel. Hopefully the dyno gains are impressive, but we'll see. If you haven't seen already, Ken's rebuild part 3, I'm actually off to the dyno this coming Monday, and me and him are going to run his car in with the tune we're going to target, being that's got forged motor. It's only got a stage 1 turbo, so that does limit us a little bit on how we can push the car, but we're going to try and run 24 pound from 3 grand and hold it to about 5500 RPM. So it is a bit of boost, but it's completely fine for the fuel we're running and for the internals, being that they're forged. So look, that I would like to assume is going to make something close to 400 wheel horsepower. This will be the same dyno that I should be getting our test car done on in a month's time. So we'll see. Ultimately, it really depends. It comes down to fueling, environmental conditions. Ken hasn't got a bigger intercooler as I do, so whilst we're in winter now and the IATs will be fine, coming summer he might lose quite a bit of power, given that that's a bit of a bottleneck. But we'll see what happens. So we're actually looking at also fabbing up some extra turbo options for the N20. So there's a little bit of fun stuff happening in the background. So hopefully we can get some more turbo options in the market, because we do believe that this motor actually, it's not as bad as everyone says it is. It really comes down to where that boost comes on and how long that boost is being held for. And we're pretty confident that 24 pound on 98 is our safe spot, especially around that 4900 RPM kind of peak point. I wouldn't run anything more than 24 pound past 4 grand, just because of the risk of the rods being bent. 23 pound seems to be okay from 3500 RPM onwards, but before that I'm a little bit skeptical on running it. Most stage 2s run 22 and a bit just after 3250 RPM. So we should be right in terms of boost. I mean, I've done a lot of R&D on this motor, so I'm pretty confident with all the research I've done what the stock motor can handle, as well as a built motor. And built motors, well into close to 800, 900 wheel horsepower with the right rods. Ken's rods are the lower end of the performance margin, but Andy's running an 800 horsepower rated set of rods, and then there's CP-Carrillos, which are somewhere around 1,000-ish, but not that I'll ever push that far. But yeah, they're well and truly overkill for this build. So yeah, we'll try and get some better turbo options on the market. There's a bit of trickery we can do with utilizing some N55 turbo options. More on that later. And our port injection and intake manifold setups are currently in the process of looking at a company to manufacture them out of like stainless or aluminium, whichever route we end up going. So we can get some mass-produced items, because what I actually found, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of this, but even on a stock turbo at about 22-ish pound of boost, on E80 or E40 for that matter, the high pressure fuel pump actually starts to dip. I know some people actually try and kind of run the high pressure fuel pump beyond its supposed specifications, i.e. like, around the 34 to 3500 PSI kind of range, you're limiting the lifespan of that pump dramatically. It's only supposed to be a 2900 to 3000 PSI pump at most. But even at 22 pound, the pump does dip. It doesn't dip too much, but it does get to some uncomfortable levels, and we have had some certain cars will actually misfire, especially if the E content's off. So anything over E40 seems to be a no-go, and even on a stock car, unless you start lowering the boost, which isn't ideal, right? You want to run an ethanol, you want to run more boost or make more power out of it. So this PI kit or the intake manifold setup that we're looking at for supplementary fueling definitely has a great market to enter into, and can hopefully provide some of your cars with some extra gains, because we do think this motor is very undervalued and is shit on, to put it nicely, by some of the community members. So we're definitely looking at pushing the development of that and further. At the end of this video, I'll actually have a little bit of a tutorial on how to install the ARP Rod bolts for the N20, because it is a little bit of an upgrade. It's a lot of people that have run them has run them purely because they want to run 24 pound of boost on a bigger turbo and they're worried about bending rods. I'd say it's probably not necessary, frankly. Like I said, stock motor, given all the math and the research I've done, 24 pound on stock hardware is completely fine. I would say the rod bolts probably stretch you to 25 or 26 if you want to run ethanol. That's kind of where I reckon that's going to push it. Still, I would not be targeting high boost pressures under 3,500. I would not. 18 pound at 2,800. 20 pound by $3,000, and then 22.5 by maybe 3,300-ish there onwards. I wouldn't be going above those before then, or you start getting into nice bendy territory. So yeah, I'll show you that video afterwards. It'll cut to black, but there are some major developments coming. It's just taking time, especially with the current global situation with this human malware going on. It's pushed a lot of things back. Some of the boys' parts haven't even arrived yet for their cars. However, obviously Ken's is almost done. So yeah, I won't be looking at doing a rebuild now on my motor till, I don't know, maybe end of next year at most. But we've definitely locked into a ported head, and then to also look at a 9180 Borg-Warner EFR turbo or something similar of that nature, to push maybe 800 wheel out of this car. I'm going to keep the 2 Series now instead of selling it in the meantime. With everything's changing, etc., financially, it makes a little bit more sense to just keep the car instead of getting a different car to put it in. We did actually look at some standalone ECU options as well for the N20. There is the Motec 183, I think, but that is ridiculously expensive for what it is. It's more of a motorsport application, frankly. However, the Link for GTI, the direct injected ECU, that is a viable alternative if you're looking to run a standalone ECU. It does seem to work, although Link apparently is also looking at releasing some more N20, N55 kind of specific ECUs later on this year. But I would assume with everything going on globally, it's probably being pushed back. These ECUs are considerably cheaper. They're more in line with like a Haltech in terms of pricing, but obviously Haltech, ironically, still don't support electronic wastegate control or, for that matter, direct injected. I mean, I understand the electronic wastegate, but the direct injected has been out for a long time, so I don't know why they haven't pushed on that. Obviously, the hassle too with running a standalone is that most of the new BMWs run on FlexRay, which means you need to find an ECU that runs on FlexRay, which ironically none of the aftermarket ECUs do. So what that basically means is that you're going to have some issues with certain modules of the car talking to that standalone, and that you just have to kind of put up with that and deal with it. It is what it is. If your steering rack doesn't communicate with the ECU well, find a solution around it. A standalone is more tailored towards a racing solution, or mixing and matching parts from maybe like the late E series, like the E90s kind of era, because you can kind of bend in terms of the communication, and some of the gear is a little bit pre-FlexRay in that regard. But that's just from research. Look, we haven't tried it. I would encourage someone to try it, because maybe it'll work, who knows. But anyway, guys, without further ado, I'll flick you over to the ARP Rod Bolt instruction guide. And probably from myself going forwards, the only videos until I can get my rebuild finished, repaired, etc., will be probably just regarding the test motor we have in the car and pushing the stock motor even further, etc. Anyway, guys, I thought I'd just upload this short video explaining how to do rod bolts on the N20. You can use a plastic edge if you want, but your results are going to be hit and miss. And it's not like it's not accurate, but you realistically spend, I paid 120 bucks Australian for my stretch gauge. It's not like the world's best one, but it's also not the worst one. So do yourself a favor. buy a stretch gauge. I mean, otherwise you can use a torque wrench, but make sure your torque wrench isn't calibrated and known to be calibrated. If it's off by a little bit, good luck, kiss your rods goodbye. They will stretch, they will bend, they'll break, etc. It's not worth it. Is this upgrade worth it? Yes and no. Hopefully, if myself and a few other guys that I'm working with can look at resolving some of the tuning issues with when it comes to larger turbos on a stock motor, then I'm going to say no, because that saves. I mean, it's a cheap upgrade, but it's a pain in the arse really in terms of labor, because you have to pull the motor up, dump the sump, dump the bottom subframe, pull the oil pump out. It's almost like doing a timing chain refresh, really, in terms of like what your labor is going to be. So it's not worth it unless you really want to do it, or if you want it as a precautionary. But at this stage, I think that's why a lot of people don't bother with the stage 2 turbo, because they have to do the rod bolts, and it's a pain because they're opening the motor. Rod bolts, viable option if you want to spend the money. Not saying it's a negative thing, not saying it's a bad thing against it. Should you need it? Hopefully going forwards, no. You should not need it for a stage 2 turbo at all. That's what we're aiming on. I've only done it as a precautionary for the stock motor. All right, so this is the ARP 2000 rod bolt. Now, this goes on these rods. As you can see, I've already done these ones. I've done them all. These just need to be torqued up. So what you do is you apply the ARP lube to the thread and to the underneath of the bolt here, and then you just do it up hand tight. So the socket to use to torque these up is a 7/16 multi-hex socket. If you try and use the 6-sided hexagonal sockets, you will find that you'll start stripping off the actual bolt head, which is not ideal. The ARP torque spec is 36 pound-foot if you don't have a stretch gauge. Otherwise, it is also between 7 thousandths and 7 thousandths, 7.5 thousandths of rod bolt stretch using a stretch gauge. So what you can do is load your torque wrench up to 36 pound-foot as a starter, and then torque it and see what stretch you get, and it might come bang on. Otherwise, you might have to just do it a little bit more. That just equates for the inaccuracies with torque wrenches, because they're not always accurate. Now, obviously, you know, if you do this up right, then you'll be able to reach the full potential of these bolts. You do too less, then you obviously can't put out as much torque, because you'll stretch the bolt even further and snap them, etc. And if you do too much, well, that'll just snap under load. So you got to get these pretty bang on. So basically, the general premise with a stretch gauge is the following. Okay, so this is my stretch gauge. So as you can see, I put the head of the bolt here, and simply, this is a bit challenging, lock it in there. Now, what you'll notice on the actual bolts, I'll show you another one here. On the head of the bolt, there is a dimple, and on the other end of the bolt is another dimple. So what is to happen here is that both ends of the stretch gauge go into there. Now, this is where you would zero it out. You rotate the auxiliary side of that. Ooh, a little bit too much. So you get that zero, then you torque it up, and then you remeasure it. Okay, so you always measure it at finger tight in the engine, and then what you do is you measure it again once it's tight. So the limit for these rod bolts in terms of stretch, as per the ARP recommendations, was up to 7 thousandths or 7.5 thousandths. You don't want to go any more than that, or you'll end up snapping your rod bolts. All right, so as you can see here, I've just fitted our stretch gauge to our rod. Now, obviously on the top side of these rods is a relief where you can actually put the other end of the stretch gauge in to fill the top side of the bolt. I've gone ahead and zeroed it out for us. Let's see if we can get a good focus on that. So it's nice and zeroed out. So now all I have to do basically is grab the torque wrench and torque it up until it meets where that other black bottom arrow is, which is about 7 thousandths of an inch. After that, I do the other side, and then I'll repeat the other two sides as well. Now, what you need to be careful of is that you need to be consistent, and you also need to double check your work, because you can sometimes also, if you tighten one side up too much, you can actually stretch the bolt on the other side a little bit too much. So it's always best to double check your results, and it's always best to also measure each bolt, because not every bolt is going to be exactly the same size at zero stretch. All right, you need to understand that. You can't just set it to zero on one bolt and then do it for all of them, because you'll end up finding out that some things are going to be out and some things are going to be under, etc., etc. So always, always, always double check your work with this stuff. And this goes for forged engines
rods as well with those bolts, any rod bolt for that matter. The factory rod bolts are these horrible, shitty torque to yield bolts. There are, I think, 70 Newton meters of torque plus, it might be 30 Newton meters of torque, sorry, plus 70 degrees of rotation, and another 70 degrees of rotation. They're pretty terrible, pretty crap.
But anyway, guys, there should be a video coming up soon too on Dyno and Ken's car and how that goes in terms of power. But peace out.